Hello, and welcome to the history of Rome. It had been 200 years since the founding of Rome, and since that time the Romans had undergone a massive transformation. In the beginning, they were a collection of pastoral herdsmen and unsavory cast-offs making their way in the world by flock and trade, and since that time they had learned to become settled farmers, tilling the land and raising crops. They had gone from being a collection of armed rabble to a society of laws with a well-equipped, well-disciplined army. They had gone from upstart village to regional capital and now stood ready to challenge a wider pool of neighbors for control of all Italy. The Etruscans lay to the north and the Greeks to the south, and having conquered the central lowlands during the reign of the kings, the Romans now turned to the hills and mountains of East Italy for fresh conquests and, as always, were forced to parry the thrust of the Etruscan cities to the north. This is the world into which the Republic was born. According to the legendary chronology, the kings were overthrown in 509 BC, though the date is highly suspect. Most likely later, patriotic Roman historians changed the timing of the event to slightly predate the establishment of democracy in Athens by Cleisthenes in 508 BC. The Romans had a hard time believing they were not first and best in everything, especially in the democracy they took so much pride in, so they altered their history to outdo the Greeks. However, without any concrete data, it is hard to know exactly when the kings were driven out, so we are forced to mark our own histories of the city with the 509 date. As I said in Part 1, the sack of Rome by the Gauls in 389 BC destroyed all primary documentation, so we are left with a mixture of legend and historical fiction. Before we get into the story of the early Republic, I want to pause for a moment and establish who exactly we are talking about here. I often say that Rome did this and that the Romans did that, but except for a few passing disambiguations, I have not done much to describe the varying nature of the population. Were they some homogeneous hive mind who agreed on everything and acted with a single will? No, quite the opposite. There were rich Romans and poor Romans and middle-class Romans. There were men and women and children. There were slaves and freed slaves and immigrants and criminals and honest men who worked hard every day and lazy men who did not. There were prostitutes and vestal virgins and intellectuals and illiterates. Just like any society, the city of Rome was inhabited by a vast array of individuals, each with their own worldview, motivation, and dream. And just like in any society, the Romans did not always get along with one another and, in fact, often fought bitterly with one another for control and freedom from control. When the Republic was founded, the population of Rome was around 130,000. This population was divided into two basic groups, the patricians and the plebes. Put simply, the patricians came from those families who could trace their roots back to the original 100 senators chosen by Romulus, and the plebes came from those that could not. Generally speaking, the distinction between patrician and plebe also followed economic class divisions, though, as we will see, it was never that simple. In the early days, the political weight of the classes was inversely related to their numerical size. The smaller set of patricians held power over the larger set of plebes. As I noted last week, the two richest classes in Rome held between them enough votes to snuff out any possible opposition, and those classes were, for the most part, made up of patricians, so the patricians made the rules. In the beginning, then, the democratic republic was really an oligarchy of wealthy, aristocratic families who shaped policy to serve their interests and who had no intention of ever letting anyone else into the decision-making process. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but let me just say that it did not take long for the plebes, especially those plebes who were wealthy, to demand a greater voice in government. This tension between the patricians and the plebes would dominate Roman politics for the duration of the empire. Outside the basic patrician-plebe dichotomy, there were those without even nominal political standing, namely women, slaves, and immigrants. These groups formed a majority in sheer numerical terms, but were denied almost all political rights. Even the plebeian males, who howled righteously at the injustice of being denied a say in government, would have cried just as loud if someone had suggested suffrage being extended to women, or slaves, or immigrants. The idea would have been beyond comprehension. And the contradictions of the early republic bear a striking resemblance to the contradictions of the early United States. When you picture the burgeoning Roman Republic, picture what you know of the burgeoning American Republic. The United States, though rhetorically cloaked in the language of freedom and equality, allowed only white, landowning males to vote. Eventually, the propertyless men agitated against the injustice of an oligarchical elite trampling on their freedoms and earned the same right, but women and blacks and Indians and the new immigrants were left out in the cold, present but unheard. This was Rome, a republic in which the disenfranchised majority were ruled by a disproportionately powerful elite. This, then, was the basic political breakdown of the population. Economically speaking, whether patrician or plebe, the majority of Romans were, by this time, settled farmers. But this was no utopia of land-owning citizen farmers. The land was owned by an elite minority and worked by the rest of the population. Economics and politics coincided just as they do today, and the tension between owner and operator mirrored the tension between patrician and plebe. Plebes were constantly agitating for land redistribution, and patricians blocked reform whenever they could. In this early stage of the empire, the actual work of the farms was still done by the lower-class citizens, slaves being an important part of the Roman economic model, but not yet the keystone upon which the entire system was based. The farms produced two basic products: food for internal consumption, usually grain and cereals, and crops for external trade, usually olives and grapes, and the refined offspring, oil and wine. The Romans, building on the roots already established by the Etruscans, used savvy trade policies to enrich themselves with all manner of foreign goods, establishing a truly international flavor in the city. But as in so many other aspects of Roman society, it was the wealthy patricians who controlled the import-export boards, and it was they who benefited the most from foreign trade. Needless to say, the landless plebe who worked in the fields did not dress in African finery and eat off of Greek silverware. Divisions were many within the population, economically and politically, and hatred abounded between the classes. But, in the end, they were all Romans, and set aside their differences any time the city was threatened, though picking up their rivalries right where they left off, when danger had passed. That all being said, it's time to continue with our story. The tyranny of the monarchy had been banished forever. It was decided, and again, when you picture this, feel free to picture the patrician senators and equites hammering out the details, because it was really them making all the early decisions. The lower classes and plebes had nothing to do with it. The two men should rule annually to avoid any single man accumulating too much power. Originally, these men were called praetors, though the title would be changed in the early 300s BC to the more familiar consul. For clarity's sake, I will use the latter designation even for the early executives who were technically praetors, because the office itself did not change, just the name, and, well, most translations of early Roman history refer to them as consuls anyway, so there is no reason to confuse an already confusing situation with a lot of semantic nitpicking. Anyway, to the Roman mind, ensuring freedom was not so much a matter of scaling back or limiting the power of the executive, as the Founding Fathers sought to do with their system of checks and balances, as it was a matter of limiting the length of time within which absolute rule could be wielded. The consuls had all the same powers a king had, near absolute power over war and peace, life and death. They just had to give it up after a year. The second consul was the one check the Romans did add into the system. One consul could veto the actions of the other, and that was that. Any consul who tried to run away with power could be stopped at a word from his colleague. If the two conspired to oppress the people, their terms of office expired after a year, and they were back to being mere citizens, with all the legal weight that would be brought down upon two men who sought to make themselves king. In the end, it was the expiring term of office that really let the Romans sleep well at night. The executive power sharing was merely a useful novelty. In that year, 509 BC, this was as far as the Republic had gone constitutionally. Rather than the comitia centuriata getting together and electing a king who served for life, they got together and elected two men who served for 1 year. As I said last week, the first two consuls were Lucius Junius Brutus and Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus. The former led the revolt against the king, and the latter's raped wife had sparked the event. Brutus's first act was to make all men swear an oath that they should never again allow a king to rule Rome. As you can see, the legacy of Numa remained a potent force. Brutus felt that a sacred oath before Jupiter would be enough to bind men to oppose monarchy, and, barring a few exceptions, it did. The Romans did not mess around with their oaths. There was, however, an immediate problem. Collatinus, you will note, bore the hated moniker Tarquinius, being a relative of the overthrown king. The population, jittery in their newfound freedom, worried that lust for power was an inborn trait of the Tarquins, and immediately regretted their election of Collatinus, despite the fact that he had helped lead the revolution and vocally denounced his cousins. When pressed, though, Collatinus agreed, for the sake of the stability and viability of the new republic, to resign the consulship, even though everyone agreed it was completely ridiculous to ask him to do so. In his place, another one of the ringleaders of the revolt was elected. Publius Valerius, who will, in a moment, earn the honorarium publicola, or friend of the people, for his service to Rome. Students of American history will immediately recognize Publius's name. The Federalist Papers, written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, in defense of the newly written Constitution, appeared in print under the pseudonym Publius in honor of this consul's role in securing Rome's new republic. Publius is often cited as being one of the original consuls of Rome, but we should not forget Collatinus and his selfless resignation in the face of baseless and superficial fears for the sake of his country's freedom. The first threat the new republic faced was the first threat all successful revolutions face, namely, counter-revolution. There were more than a few Romans who had lived just fine under the kings, and were in no mood to lose their privileged place in society. A collection of young nobles, including 2 sons of the consul Brutus, conspired with envoys of the exiled King Tarquin to betray the city to him and reinstate the monarchy. The plot was revealed by one of the noble's slaves, and the entire group was arrested. Brutus was shocked to see his own sons involved in the affair, but incontrovertible evidence was produced confirming their guilt. The penalty for treason was severe, and despite his tortured misgivings, Brutus would not stop the sentence from being carried out. The young conspirators were tied to a post, scourged, and then beheaded. Brutus's decision was long lauded by the Romans as a patriotic sacrifice, teaching a moral lesson about putting the welfare of the state before even one's own family, but the ruthlessness of the decision often makes it difficult for us to see the nobility of the act. The second threat the new republic faced was the second threat all successful revolutions face, namely, invasion by an opportunistic enemy trying to take advantage of a neophyte central government. Tarquin had by this time taken refuge in Veii and pleaded with the nobility there to aid him in reconquering Rome. He argued that the virus of republicanism might infect Etruria and wipe out all the royal families in the region. The nobles of Veii were indeed worried about their subjects catching the freedom bug and, believing that Rome's leadership would be shaky and disjointed without a strong king in charge, agreed to aid Tarquin and attacked. However, to the surprise and consternation of Tarquin and the Veiites, Brutus and Publius proved to be extremely capable commanders, routing the army from Veii easily. The battle was not without tragedy for the Romans, though. In the middle of the fight, Brutus, liberator of Rome, was killed. His body was borne back to the city, and Rome went into mourning for a full year. Publius now stood alone and, like Collatinus before him, soon fell under suspicion by the fickle and paranoid masses. After the battle with the Veiites, Publius began construction on a home atop the Velia, a ridge jutting from the north side of the Palatine Hill. The people suspected him of making a fortress from which he could safely enslave them all. Publius caught wind of the sentiment and called a mass meeting, shaming the populace for their irrational fears and announcing that if it worried them so much, he would move his home to the bottom of the hill, where they could all keep watch on him. He further used the opportunity provided by the meeting to propose 2 new laws, which made him a hero to the now assuaged masses and earned him the aforementioned title Publicola. The 2 laws are famous even to this day. The first stated that any man who tried to make himself king could be killed at any time by any other man without fear of reprisal. And the second stated that any decision by the magistrates could be appealed to the people's assemblies. Publius, content with the single credit he received for these democratic initiatives, then called for an election to fill the open consulship. Marcus Horatius Pulvius was eventually elected after a short detour through a consul who was elected but then died from old age a few days later. And this closed the first year of the Republic, leadership settled, the people mollified, and Rome secure. In the coming years, the tension between patrician and plebe would dominate public life in Rome, the patricians wary always of runaway mob rule, and the plebes seeing no practical difference between the overthrown king and the newly empowered Senate. Next week, we will jump headlong into this so-called conflict of the orders and witness the plebes voting with their feet and demanding a real voice in the allegedly democratic republic they had all fought so hard to establish and keep. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Last week, we discussed the transitional year of 509 BC, when Rome went from being a typical Italian kingdom to an atypical Italian republic. Though the actual workings of the republic were not as democratic as they appeared on the surface, the fact remained that the monarchy had been abolished and annual elections now determined leadership. The first years after the change would prove difficult for the new government, for it faced both internal dissension and external invasion. Those years would see the final defeat of the Tarquins, the resubduing of Latium, and finally the extension of political rights to the plebes with the creation of the office of tribune, the plebeian answer to the patrician consulship. After his Viate army was defeated, the ex-king Tarquin next took refuge in the Etruscan city of Clusium under the protection of its king, Lars Porsena. Tarquin begged Porsena to attack the Romans, repeating his line about the threat democracy posed to royalty everywhere and the necessity of returning a king to the throne. Porsena, like the Viates, no doubt took this argument under advisement, but when he agreed to make war with the Romans, he did so ultimately for his own reasons. There are two accounts of what happened next. Either Porsena invaded and was successfully repulsed, or he invaded and captured the city. The former is alleged by Roman folk tales, the latter is supported by modern historical analysis. According to the legendary tradition, Porsena, in defense of his fellow Etruscan king Tarquin, marched south and was met by the Roman forces at the Tiber. The Romans, seeing the size of the Etruscan army, fled back across the river, leaving the bridge, and therefore the city, unguarded. A single Roman soldier named Horatius, realizing he could not prevent the army's flight, ordered men to set fire to the bridge in order to prevent the Etruscans from crossing and sacking the city. To buy time, he stood alone on the far side of the bridge and challenged the whole of Porsena's army to combat. While the dumbstruck Etruscans tried to figure out what they should do with this crazy brave but clearly suicidal soldier, the other Romans set fire to the wooden bridge. The Etruscans were finally snapped out of their stupor when the burning bridge collapsed into the river and attacked, but Horatius jumped in the river and swam unscathed to the other side, saving the city and enrolling himself in the pantheon of great Roman heroes. Porsena was forced to initiate a siege, which proved no more effective than his initial assault, again due to the bravery of a single Roman citizen. This time it was Mucius Scaevola, who proved his valor and secured ultimate victory for Rome. The city was suffering under Porsena's siege and showed no signs of being able to fight it off. Mucius, taking matters into his own hand, crossed over to the Etruscan camp. He made his way to Porsena's headquarters and waited for an opportunity to strike. When Porsena's entourage emerged, Mucius attempted to assassinate the king, but, unsure of who his target was, mistakenly attacked one of the king's secretaries. Mucius was seized and dragged before the shaken king. What happened next would be the stuff of Roman legend and a moral story to inspire generation upon generation of future citizens. Mucius told the king that the Romans had declared war not on the men of Clusium but upon Porsena personally, and that he was merely the first in a long line of assassins who would not stop until the king was dead. The king, unnerved by this idea, ordered Mucius burned alive and found himself only further unnerved by what Mucius did next. The Roman stuck his right hand into the fire and, without flinching, allowed it to burn. He declared that such was the regard Roman men held for their bodies, and that the king should remember what lay in store for him. Porsena was, to say the least, impressed and very freaked out. He allowed Mucius to go free, commending the man for his bravery, and not wishing to live his life under a death sentence from a bunch of psychotic patriot assassins, he made peace with Rome and lifted the siege, never having taken the city. This was the official legend. Other, non-Roman sources tell a different, more plausible story. In this version, Porsena did indeed take Rome in the turbulent years after the founding of the Republic and set up a puppet government. The outcome seems reasonable in that the Etruscans of Clusium would have been much stronger and far better equipped than the Romans were at this point, and resistance would have been futile at best. The reason Porsena, who is a confirmed historical figure, invaded Rome is a further divide between fact and legend. The melodrama of Tarquin's plea for Etruscan solidarity is pure fiction, as is the decisiveness of individual Roman bravery. Population upheaval in Italy around 500 BC had resulted in an estrangement between Etruria and their Greek trading partners in the south. Specifically, Etruscan trade routes were disrupted by the Volscians, a central Italian hill tribe who settled the plains between Etruria and Magna Graecia south of Rome. Porsenna's conquest of the Romans was just a step in the greater project of maintaining the safety of the southern trade roads from attack. Disabusing the notion that the war had been waged on Tarquin's behalf, Porsenna left his son in charge of matters in Latium after defeating Rome. His son, though, was defeated by an army of allied Latins and driven back north, re-securing independence for Rome as an unintended byproduct. The Latin communities emerged strong from the encounter, and Rome humbled, setting up a major confrontation for control of central Italy that would ultimately see Rome re-emerge as the dominant force in Latium for another 150 years. The Latins had chafed under Roman rule during the reign of the Tarquins, and took the opportunity presented by Rome's weakened position to attempt a redrawing of the political landscape. Disorganized by Porsenna's invasion and a lack of internal political unity, Rome seemed easy pickings for the emboldened Latins. But they underestimated Rome's will, a common mistake made by enemies of the empire for years to come. An alliance of Latin communities broke from the Romans and forced the issue into an armed conflict, which they thought would see them master Rome, but instead it led them right back under the yoke. A decisive battle was fought near Lake Regillus, southeast of Rome, and though the details of the fight are unimportant, the Battle of Lake Regillus is important for two reasons. First, as I mentioned, it ended Latin resistance to Rome for another 150 years, until, embroiled in a long war with the Samnites, Rome was again seen as vulnerable enough to resist. Second, it marked the first time that a dictator led a Roman army in battle. The office of dictator was a curious instrument to find within the constitution of a republic, but the Romans felt that extraordinary emergencies called for extraordinary solutions, and dictators were appointed periodically over the years when such emergencies arose. Basically, a dictator was appointed when all the red tape needed to be cut through, and one single man needed to take decisive action now, without complaint or appeal or challenge. According to law, a dictator could be appointed for one 6-month term, at the end of which he would resign and power would revert back to the consuls. At the beginning of his term, the dictator appointed a vice-dictator, called his master of horse, who was accountable to no one but the dictator himself. The Romans were sufficiently distressed by the hostility of the Latins that they used their extraordinary solution for the first time to lead an army against a foreign threat. And technically the first dictator ever appointed had been a man named Titus Lartius, who had served briefly in that position 2 years before to quell internal riots, but beyond trivia, the event is hardly worth mentioning. The appointment of Aulus Postumius, however, was a watershed moment. Lartius's appointment had been a ploy used by the patricians to put the fear of God back into the plebes, which of course it did, but there was never any question of actually instilling him with dictatorial powers for any period of time. Postumius, however, was given the keys to the city and told to do whatever was necessary to defeat the Latins, essentially that he was now a law unto himself. Postumius did indeed lead the army to victory over the Latins, and then, in a remarkable display of constitutional loyalty, stepped down from the heady heights of absolute dictatorship and restored the consuls to their rightful positions. The remarkable giving up of power demonstrates both Postumius's personal honor and the extent to which Rome as a whole probably would have cried out for his murder if he had considered remaining in power. The monarchy really was dead, and though dictators would be appointed off and on for the next 450 years, it was not until Julius Caesar that a dictator did not ultimately resign of his own free will. The Latins reconquered and the dictatorship passed, Rome found itself at peace. And as a general rule, whenever Rome found itself at peace abroad, it immediately found itself divided at home. The question of plebeian rights, never satisfactorily settled, now reared its head once again. The plebes were not to be put off this time. No amount of patrician chicanery and backroom dealing would break their solidarity. Only rights guaranteed by law would satisfy them now. The plebes would ultimately win political concessions from the patricians, though it took the first recorded strike in history to do so. Trouble arose over the matter of debt bonding. In Roman law at the time, if a debtor could not pay his creditor, then he became a bonded servant to the creditor until the debt was repaid. The system of indentured servitude essentially made permanent slaves of the debtors because, while servants to the creditors, they were unable to earn any money to pay off their debts. Many of the soldiers who fought in the recent war against the Latins found themselves bonded in this way. The practice in this case was especially egregious because the debts were incurred while the men were off fighting in patriotic defense of the city. The plebes agitated for debt relief, but were rebuffed by the patricians, whose attitude was basically, you take on the debt, you pay the price. Offended by this high-handed treatment, the plebes were on the verge of full-blown revolt when the city suddenly found itself under attack from all sides. The Sabines, Volscians, and Aquians all began making forays into Roman territory, and the Senate called for armies to be raised. The plebes sensed an opportunity, and when the consuls began calling names for enlistment, not one of them made a move. The Senate was basically beside itself at this mass act of treason and immediately appointed a dictator to smash the resistance. But in an amazing display of moderation and wisdom, they appointed the brother of Publius Publicola, Manlius Valerius, whom the plebes loved, to the office. Valerius begged the plebes to do their duty and enlist, promising that once hostilities were concluded, the issue of debt relief would be addressed straight away. Swayed by Valerius, they relented and legions were formed. In due course, all three foreign threats were put down, and the legions returned to Rome. Back in the city, however, Valerius was unable to fulfill his promise. The patrician senators blocked his attempts at debt relief, and Valerius resigned his office, laying at the Senate's feet all domestic turmoil that would ensue as a result of their decision. The disbanded legionaries were outraged at the betrayal and took an extraordinary step that would become known to history as the secession of the plebes. The soldiers marched en masse to the Sacred Mount, a hill 3 miles from Rome, and set up a fortified camp, refusing to return to the city until their demands were met. The population of the city flew into a panic. The remaining plebes feared retaliatory violence from the patricians, and conversely, the patricians feared runaway mob violence without the army around to maintain order. And what they both feared the most was external invasion. If word got out that Rome's army had abandoned her, every two-bit tribe in the neighborhood would come knocking on the city gates, and Rome would be at their mercy. So the Senate relented and sent an envoy to the plebe camp to broker a deal. The settlement did not address the debt question directly. Rather, a new office was created to shield the plebes from future patrician tyranny, the tribunate. The dangerous precedent set by the strike was pointed out to the plebes by the patrician envoy, who compared the republic to a body. It is true, he told them, the hands and feet and mouth could join forces and stop working for the lazy stomach, who sat there greedily receiving all the food the other parts worked for. But if they were to do so, the entire body would soon die of starvation, for the stomach pumped energy back out into the limbs. The plebes would be granted more rights to end the secession, the envoy said, but they must not think, in the future, that starving the stomach was in their enlightened best interest. The plebes took some note of this, but were so absorbed with their success that it is doubtful the lesson fully sank in. The role of tribune was defensive in nature. 2 plebeian men would be elected each year to act as a counterweight to the consuls. Initially, the power of the tribunes was modestly held to the right to free any man from patrician imprisonment, though in the future they would gain the right to veto, literally, I forbid, any law passed by the consuls or the Senate at a word. The tribunes were also granted sacrosanctity, or the right to be free from harm. The plebes took a solemn oath to kill any man who attempted to assault a tribune, and more than once that oath was fulfilled. The tribunate would become a flashpoint for Roman politics for the remainder of the Republic. The eventual power to veto led to a number of showdowns with the patricians, both sides bloodying themselves in their attempts to control state policy. The power of the office would peak with the Gracchi brothers around 125 BC and fall into obsolescence with the ascension of the Caesars. But for the bulk of the Republican period, it was an important and powerful office. The tribunes would be elected by a new assembly called the Comitia Tributa, which would be made up of the now 35 tribes of Rome. Suffrage in the assembly was not based on a property assessment, as it was with the Centuriata, and so the Comitia Tributa was as democratic a form as Rome would ever see. The secession of the plebes occurred in 494 BC, about 15 years after the birth of the Republic. Though domestic combustion and foreign invasion were constant threats, the Republic had passed through its infancy and emerged as an adolescent power ready for fresh challenges. Any threat posed by the ex-king Tarquin was gone, and monarchy was now firmly in the rearview mirror. The attempted revolt by the Latin communities had been suppressed by a Republican army, and Rome managed to maintain control of Latium just as it had while a monarchy. The patricians and plebes were settled in an alliance, uneasy though it may have been, and the population was more or less at peace with itself. Next week we will cover the creation of the final piece of the Republican puzzle, the Law of the 12 Tables, as well as discuss the rising threat posed by the Volscians, which caused the Romans to make their first concerted forays into the eastern hills, where they would fight the wars that would ultimately win them control of all Italy. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. We ended last week with the plebes finally being granted nominal political rights, or at least defenders within the political arena, with the creation of the office of tribune. This stopped plebeian agitation for a while, but as the years passed, a new generation came of age and demanded further protection from the ever-present threat of patrician tyranny. It was not enough to be protected from an abuse of the law, because, at the time, nobody knew exactly what the law was. The legal framework of Rome was a nebulous body of oral and written traditions, with precedents and subclauses hiding all over the place, in official decrees, letters, pronouncements, and, most dangerously, in the minds of old patrician lawyers. Who was to say a man was being treated unjustly if no one knew exactly what justice was? This new generation of plebeian agitators would ultimately win a great victory for themselves and the rule of law, giving the Romans a set of written precepts that would be memorized by every child and recited by every adult, the 12 Tables of Roman law. This official codification of the law occurred around 451 BC, but before we get to that point in our story, I want to give a brief account of what Rome dealt with in the 40-odd years between the inception of the tribunate and the creation of the 12 Tables. Internally, Rome was full of tension, but, as I said, for the first 20 years or so, nothing boiled over too much to disrupt the day-to-day, year-to-year operations of the city. The consuls and senate still held the lion's share of the power, though they were now checked somewhat by the tribunes. The Romans were held together by an unceasing series of wars against their neighbors to the north, east, and south. To the north, they fought a particularly hard campaign against their old nemesis, the Veites, that ended in a stalemate in 474 BC, a campaign that came complete with a dressed-up Battle of Thermopylae, with 306 members of the noble Fabii family cast in the role of King Leonidas and his doomed Spartans. Protecting an undefensible pass, the Fabii clan fought to the last man to give the legions a chance to regroup. The battles fought to the east and south were of a different sort, and revolved around a geographically based cultural clash. Veii may have been in competition with Rome, but at least it was a settled city of civilized farmers. Out in the eastern hills, however, nomadic tribes, particularly the Volscians and the Aequians, pressed at Rome's borders. The nomadic herdsmen coveted Rome's soft, flat land and tried every year to carve out some or all of Roman territory and turn it from parceled farms into a massive grazing zone. As a result, the Romans were constantly beating back encroachment by the migrant tribes, who occasionally mustered enough force to give the Romans a run for their money, but were usually dispatched easily. For the first 10 years after the secession of the plebes, and running concurrently with the on-again, off-again battles with Veii, the Volscians posed the greatest danger. They had already made great inroads south of the city, effectively securing all the land between the hills and the sea, blocking trade with Magna Graecia. The peak of the Volscian threat came early, in 491 BC, when a disgruntled Roman general named Coriolanus defected and led a Volscian army through the legions and right to the gates of the city. The Roman men beaten, the women were sent to plead with Coriolanus to end his attack, and it was only after a personal appeal from his own mother that Coriolanus' heart finally turned and he withdrew the army. His Volscian officers were appalled at being denied their easy victory, and back in Volscian territory they murdered their Roman leader. It has been noted that the story of Coriolanus bears a striking resemblance to the story of the great Athenian general Themistocles, and that the story was probably inserted later to account for the defeat suffered by Rome at the hands of nomadic rabble. The Roman ego demanded that Romans could only be defeated by other Romans. By the mid-480s BC, though, the Volscian threat had largely been contained, and the city was never seriously threatened again, though the Volscians maintained control over the southern plains for the remainder of the century, and were a constant menace along Rome's borders. Throughout the 470s and 460s BC, even though the external danger had been greatly diminished, the legions still went out every summer campaigning against the latest forays by the Volscians or Aequian raiders. The total military dominance of Rome over the hill tribes eventually led the plebe leaders to suspect that the patricians were not being totally honest with the threat level posed by the tribes. And with the record the Roman army had, it's hard to blame them. Without even breaking a sweat, the legions dispatched every enemy they encountered. A political pattern began to emerge. Plebe leaders would decry the raising of yet another army to go to battle with the Volscians or whoever, even though they posed no serious threat, and would denounce the Senate for starting wars to put off questions of further economic and political reform. These leaders would always, in turn, be denounced by the Senate as self-absorbed traitors who were putting personal ambition ahead of Rome's safety. The plebe leaders would shoot back that the patricians were sending men out to die for no other reason than to tighten their grip on wealth and power. A standoff would ensue, but Rome, being what it was, would ultimately raise the legion and the plebeian demagogues would be silenced. The Romans were soldiers, and fighting is what they did. Throughout these years, Rome's position vis-a-vis the nomadic herdsmen was never seriously threatened, though in the following century Rome would fight a knockdown, drag-out war with a rising hill tribe called the Samnites that would ultimately see all Italy eventually fighting on one side or the other. In the years after the secession of the plebes, there were essentially two major initiatives that excited the plebes and kept the patricians up at night. The first was proposed by a tribune named Valero in 473 BC. It stated simply that the tribunes ought to be elected by the tribal assembly and not by the comitia centuriata as they had been in the first years after the office was created. The patricians balked at the idea, knowing full well that they would no longer have undue weight in choosing who would be tribune. As I noted last week, the patricians inevitably failed in their attempt to quash the proposal. An election of the tribunes was duly passed to the comitia tributa. As if this wasn't bad enough, in 462 BC, a tribune named Terentillus made an even more radical proposal. The laws of Rome should be written down and posted so that all citizens would be bound to the same codes and no man could rise above them. The patricians were horrified at the thought and spent the next 10 years doing everything in their power to stop its implementation. It was during these years that the plebes really started to resist military service and openly question patrician motives. At one point, however, caught up in their own rhetoric, they failed to believe it when the Senate woke up one morning and announced that during the night, a small Sabine army had penetrated the city and had taken the citadel. It was only after a desperate plea by the consuls that the plebes finally agreed to raise an army, finding much to their surprise that the citadel had in fact been taken and their city was under siege. The legions, along with a contingent of local allies, easily dislodged the Sabines, and the greatest casualty of the whole encounter was what little influence the tribunes had so recently achieved. The patricians, as a result, managed to put off Terentillus' proposal for another 10 years. In the end, though, they were forced to relent. Political consciousness had been raised in the city by travelers from the south who brought with them word of Solon's political reforms in the great Greek city of Athens, causing proponents of reform to beat a steady drum. Finally, a combination of plague, famine, and the economically destabilizing introduction of coins as a medium of exchange in 454 BC led to a crisis of confidence in the leadership, and something had to be done to assuage the masses. It was agreed in 451 BC that consular power for the year would be transferred to a body of 10 men called the decemvirate, whose main task it would be to collect and condense Roman law into a single uniform code to be published on bronze tablets in the Forum for all to see. Unfortunately, the total contents of the 12 tables, each posted on a separate bronze tablet, hence the name, have been lost to history, and all we have to rely on is occasional excerpts and summaries by later Roman authors. We know generally what topics each table covered, and the range in detail gives a fascinating insight into the Roman mind. Held within the tables, written 2,500 years ago, we find the basis for many of our own founding principles. For example, the ninth table explicitly forbids passage of laws against specific individuals, a principle still in force today, while the first table establishes the sanctity of the subpoena, or the requirement to appear before a court. The tables covered a wide range of matters, from lawsuit procedures to payment of debts, to inheritance rights, to upkeep of public sewers, to divorce and property boundary issues. I will not bore you with a lengthy recitation of the contents of each table, but I do want to highlight some of the more curious facets of the Roman legal mind. For example, according to the 8th table, a thief caught at night may be killed without penalty, but if the same thief is caught during the day, he must be delivered unharmed to the magistrates. Contained within the same table, we discover what the penalty was for throwing an unaimed weapon into a crowd. The accused was fined 1 ram. The 7th table states that fruit that falls from a tree onto a neighbor's property shall be the property of that neighbor, a provision which demonstrates just how scrupulously litigious the Romans could be. Death was the ultimate penalty and was prescribed for a number of crimes, including murder and the destruction of crops, but also, interestingly, for matters involving the integrity of the courts. Magistrates who took bribes to influence their decisions, as well as witnesses who lied under oath, were both ordered flung from a high cliff. To the Romans, perjury was a heinous crime that threatened the entire community. The final provision I want to point out was hidden deep in the 9th table, a piece of fine print that, once discovered, outraged the plebes and led to violent class confrontations. No patrician shall be allowed to marry a plebe. Effectively, this codified a closing off of upward social mobility to the majority of the population and guaranteed that none of them would ever hold the most powerful office of state, the consulship. This did not go over well with the plebes. As I mentioned earlier, the 12 tables were the foundation of later Roman law and were memorized by all citizens, literate or not. The existence of a written body of law was not a Roman innovation, nor did it make them unique in the ancient world, but it did put them into a select group of states that valued the objectivity of the law over the subjectivity of capricious rulers. The story of the decemvirs, the magistrates tasked with the compilation, ends with an interesting bit of legendary melodrama. During the year, or 2 depending on the source, that the decemvirs were in office, they held ultimate authority. The unbroken chain of consular elections had been broken, and effectively a new form of government had been briefly ushered in. Rather than rule by 2 men, it was rule by 10 men. And among those 10 men, one was first among equals, a man named Appius Claudius. Claudius came from a family of staunch patricians, and was a vigorous opponent of just about any proposed plebeian reform. After finishing their appointed task, the decemvirate had lost their raison d'etre and was set to disband, but Claudius, enjoying his newfound power, convinced his colleagues that they should remain in office after their term expired. The other decemvirs, similarly enjoying the trappings of power, agreed, and when the consular elections for that year arrived, the decemvirate simply did not allow anyone to stand, and no elections were held. The people found themselves unexpectedly in a constitutional crisis. Even though Claudius and the decemvirs had made a naked power grab, there was no legal avenue available to stop them, for the decemvirate had been instilled with all judicial authority. Ironically, the body of men who laid down the laws were the first to blatantly ignore them. Days and weeks passed with the decemvirate maintaining their illegal hold on power, until finally Claudius went too far and the entire city rose up in revolt. Claudius had his eye on a beautiful plebeian girl who was said to be married to a young army officer. Claudius declared out of the blue that the girl in question was an escaped slave owned by one of his clients and that she must be returned. A hearing was called to decide the case, and numerous witnesses were brought up, attesting to the freeborn status of the young woman. But the trial was overseen by Claudius, who, to the astonishment of everyone present, ruled that the girl was indeed an escaped slave and was the property of the complaining client, despite obvious evidence to the contrary. The people were appalled at this absurd conclusion, and the army, when it caught wind of the decision, joined in their outrage. The husband-to-be and the father of the woman were both officers in good standing, and the army was incredulous at the arbitrary injustice of Claudius towards one of their own. The people, supported by the army, then used their bargaining chip of last resort and abandoned the city, removing themselves to the sacred mount just as they had done 40 years earlier. The decemvirs, recognized that their position had become untenable, finally resigned. Claudius was arrested, but rather than face trial, he killed himself. Regular consular elections then took place, and Rome's domestic tranquility was restored. The plebeians actually emerged from the order better off than they had been, For in their negotiations to return to the city, they demanded the number of tribunes be raised to 10, which the Senate, anxious to get things back to normal and again fearing invasion, agreed to. And of course, the codification of the laws, the decades-long plebeian demand, had already been accomplished, leaving them in a much stronger position legally to fend off future patrician tyranny. The creation of the 12 tables left the plebes on the one hand overjoyed, but on the other they were horrified by some of the provisions it contained. True, the rule of law would now dominate patrician subjectivity, but that one sticking point of the illegality of patrician-plebe marriage opened their eyes to an oppression that they never knew existed. Only patricians could be consuls or hold the other high magistracies, including Pontifex Maximus. If no plebe could ever marry a patrician, then no plebe would ever hold high office, and the patricians would always and forever hold the winning political hand. The next cycle of patrician-plebe conflict would revolve around this very issue, eventually leading to a number of reforms that further diluted the patrician stranglehold on power, which we will get to in the weeks ahead. Those of you who know Roman history may have noticed that I ran right by one of the most well-known folk legends, which occurred around 460 BC, without so much as a mention. That is because next week I want to focus in detail on the central figure of that story, the great Cincinnatus, whose career spans both sides of the decemvirate interlude. Join me next week as we untangle the man from the myth and figure out what made Cincinnatus such a towering figure that American settlers felt compelled to name their new boomtown on the Ohio River after a Roman who had been dead 2,200 years. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. We ended last week in 451 BC with the 12 tables of law written down and the decemvirate expelled. This week I want to step back a few years to focus on the life of one man, Lucius Quintius Cincinnatus, who was passed into the collective memory as a paradigm of republican virtue, even though the decisive moments of his life were almost certainly invented by later historians to embellish his famous career, and, in the end, nothing he did was particularly unprecedented. Still, his biography continues to resonate, and taken by itself, it is a pretty good story of a humble man who had absolute power thrust upon him, and then, remarkably, relinquished that power and returned to his plow. A man who sacrificed everything for the Republic. Cincinnatus was born around 519 BC, when the king still reigned, and was just a boy when Brutus and Collatinus expelled the Tarquins. He was therefore one of the first citizens in Rome who lived his entire life under a republican government, without strong memories of the monarchy. He was in the vanguard of a critical generation. His elders remembered vividly the tyranny of Tarquin, and their steadfast republican principles reflect a personally developed hatred of monarchy. They were the victims and would do anything to avoid being victims again. Cincinnatus, however, and those of his generation, never personally experienced this victimization. Once they came of age, the Republic would have to sink or swim on its own merit. If a would-be tyrant began to acquire too much power, there would be no one to turn to and say, "Hey, remember Tarquin? This guy's trying to be another Tarquin," because there would be no one left who actually remembered Tarquin. It is in this passing from living memory that mistakes of history repeat themselves. Ambitious men of later generations might attempt to seize power, and, believing their times to be unique, a cowering population might allow it. In those times, only vigilance born of a love of republic, not a hatred of monarchy, would save the people from slavery, and Cincinnatus was amongst the first to set down that love of the republic for its own sake. To dispel one myth straight away, Cincinnatus was at no point a defender of the little guy. He was a patrician by birth and upbringing, and when he emerged on the public stage, it was as a steadfast opponent of the tribunes and their reforms. His first appearance in the historical record is not a starring role, but rather a supporting part in the drama of his son Caeso. There is a great deal of civil unrest in the aftermath of Tarentillus's proposal to codify the law, and plebe demonstrations in the Forum were often broken up by collections, or gangs if you prefer, of young patrician nobles. Caeso, an abnormally large young man, took to this with great relish, personally beating and chasing any plebe who tried to take part in such demonstrations. Young and hot-tempered that he was, though, he was easy pickings for a savvy tribune named Virginius, who intentionally goaded Caeso by leading provocative public marches that would inevitably draw the wrath of the young man. Once he had enough witnesses and evidence, Virginius brought capital charges against Caeso for, well, all the horrible things he had done. Caeso was ordered to appear at a trial, and if he did not, then he would be fined a large sum of money. It is at this point that Cincinnatus makes his first appearance in the public record, defending his son against Virginius's accusations and asking that the charges be dropped. Rather than face an obviously hostile and biased court, Caeso fled north to Etruria and out of the history of Rome completely. His son having essentially jumped bail, Cincinnatus was forced to sell most of his properties to pay the debt, leaving him a pauper with only a small plot of land on the far side of the Tiber. It is from this impoverished state that Cincinnatus' own legend begins. In 460 BC, not long after the Sabines had been expelled from the citadel, Cincinnatus was chosen to serve as one of the 2 consuls for that year. The tribunes were less than thrilled at this development, recognizing that they had just put the screws to this old man because they were angry with his son, and now he was in a position of authority over them. Cincinnatus did nothing to ease their minds, immediately attacking the character of the plebe leadership, who he accused of aiding and abetting the Sabine capture of the citadel with their selfish myopia. This set the tone for the year. Struggles ensued between the consuls on the one hand, the tribunes on the other, with the Senate and popular assemblies caught in between. Cincinnatus managed to kill Tarentilus' bill for the year, while the tribunes banned the consuls from taking any army more than 1 mile outside the city limits. By the end of the year, no compromise was reached, and the battle was set to continue on into the next year, but the Senate passed a law stating that no magistrate, patrician or plebe, could serve in successive years. The tribunes dismissed this out of hat and had themselves re-elected, so the patricians were set to reconfirm Cincinnatus when he announced that if they were to act no better than the plebes, then they were no better than the plebes, and refused to stand for office. Agreeing reluctantly to this logic, the patricians allowed Cincinnatus to retire to his small farm. It would not be long, however, before he was called back to service in his most famous role, dictator of Rome. In 458, the Aequians had been causing Rome trouble, and one of the consuls for the year was sent with an army to deal with them. However, the fight was much rougher than it had been in the past, and the legions found themselves pinned down, unable to retreat, and facing annihilation. The citizens of Rome panicked, and, without dissent, a dictator was called for, and Cincinnatus was named. A delegation was sent to inform the old man, and famously found him at work on the small farm he had retired to, a living paradigm of Roman virtue. The delegation saluted Cincinnatus as dictator, imploring him to return to the city at once. The tribunes were appalled to see their old political enemy return to such a powerful position, but Cincinnatus was greeted in the city with such acclaim that there was little they could do but hope that the old patrician would not turn his absolute power against them. Cincinnatus, however, was not out to settle political grudges, well, not yet anyway, and promptly raised an army and marched to the rescue of the besieged legion. Wasting no time, Cincinnatus' army swept in and decisively beat the Aequians, saving the legion and ending the threat. He marched back to Rome and celebrated his well-earned triumph a mere 15 days after being named dictator. Before stepping down, though, Cincinnatus did clear up one bit of family business, forcing Virginius to plead guilty to perjury and go into exile. Rome safe and his family's honor restored, Cincinnatus resigned the dictatorship and returned to his farm, a hero in his own time and a legend thereafter. He would make one final appearance in the public record 20 years later, again appointed as dictator, though this time it was to deal with internal strife and not an external threat. Ironically, it was an attempt by a single man to capture total power in Rome that led to the reappointment of Cincinnatus as dictator. We will talk more next week about the plot of Malleus to make himself king, so for now I will just leave it that a conspiracy was in motion and Cincinnatus was brought in to deal with it, which he did as quickly as he dispatched the Aequians and again resigned the dictatorship and returned to his farm, this time for the last time. Cincinnatus is a bona fide legend, but the particulars of his life are almost certainly an invention. I look forward to the day when I begin covering events from the later, more accurate records, so I won't have to keep saying that the story I've just told you is largely fictitious, but we still have another 50 years before we get to the sack of Rome, so we'll just have to grind through this together. Anyway, the story of Cincinnatus is largely fictitious. But the man was a giant of his age and earned a little mythical embellishment. And regardless of its accuracy, the life of Cincinnatus was handed down from generation to generation and is still told today. His story had a great impact on the Enlightenment age soldiers of the American Continental Army, who often referred to their great leader, General Washington, as the American Cincinnatus, because at the end of the war he retired rather than allow the people to make him king. When the army was demobilized, the retired officers formed a fraternity of sorts called the Society of the Cincinnati, membership in which was limited to men who had served in the army for 3 years. One of their members was later the territorial governor of Ohio, and he renamed a growing urban hub on the Ohio River Cincinnati, both in honor of the society itself and in honor of Washington, to whom the name originally referred. Ironically, the society still exists today, membership being limited to sons of the original members, making it a hereditary institution, completely anathema to everything the officers had originally been commissioned to fight. But I digress. Cincinnatus's mark had been set upon the world. But what do we make of him? Clearly he was a towering figure in the first century of the Republic, a hero, a consul, a twice-named dictator. But why the iconic veneration? Allegedly it is for the act of relinquishing absolute power, but we have already seen that Cincinnatus was not the first man to do this, nor would he be the last. The office of dictator was not created especially for him. It was, in fact, a constitutional role that was used regularly in times of crisis. His story, of course, had a nice ring to later Romans, who reveled in his simple homespun virtue, called from his field to save the city. In the good old days, they said, the greatest man of his age was found hard at work on a small farm, not eating figs on a sofa in some palatial estate. He was the epitome of the virtuous farmer-soldier, the ideal Roman. I think 2 things really contribute to the fame of Cincinnatus. The first is the incidental fact that most people, myself included before I began digging, believe Cincinnatus must have either been the first dictator of Rome or the only dictator of Rome to ever step down voluntarily, or something equally unprecedented. But of course there was nothing particularly unprecedented about Cincinnatus, and our veneration of him in that case would seem to be based upon nothing more than our own misconceptions about Roman history. But even though Cincinnatus wasn't the first or last of anything, he was unique in a profound way. The first 2 dictators, who, like Cincinnatus, served and then resigned, were men of a generation that remembered the Tarquins, remembered the tyranny, and would not think for a moment about seizing power for themselves so soon after they had thrown out the kings. Cincinnatus, on the other hand, comes from the next generation, a generation that lived their entire lives under the Republic, and was thus the first man who had no memory of monarchy to be given absolute power. The temptation to keep it would not this time be tempered by memories of subjugation and struggle. But the virtue of Cincinnatus returned to the people the power that was rightfully theirs. It was his resignation from dictatorship that really cemented the precedent for later Romans to relinquish dictatorial power and maintain the Republic, that thing of the people. In that case, Cincinnatus really does deserve all the praise he is given for selflessly handing the reins of power back to the people, where it would remain for hundreds of years. In any case, any man who voluntarily gives up absolute power is a hero whose story, rightfully, is told. Next week we will learn more about the machinations of Malleus, a scoundrel of the highest order, as well as the events that led up to the final confrontation with Veii, a struggle that broke the back of Etruscan dominance, which, though a victory for Rome, opened the door for the Gauls to sweep in from the north and hand the Romans their most devastating defeat, almost ending the empire before it had a chance to really begin.